We're continuing our talk about the idea of science and technology and the kind of tension between those ideas within Western culture and the way in which those ideas might exist within Indigenous culture. In the West, we've got very kind of, I suppose, stringent ideas about the organisation of things like time, or how we understand the notion of time, and I think it's very linear. Is that, in your understanding, the same within Aboriginal culture?
It's very different, actually, Kitty. One of the main differences between Indigenous science and Western science is the idea of time, in that Indigenous people tend to think of time as a circular thing. And what I mean by that is that life is a circle. Everything they do is a circle. So rather than have, say, something happen 100 years ago, and we always say that history doesn't repeat itself, or, you can't go back to yesterday, those sorts of phrases are common in our terminology in today's society. But in Indigenous life is a circle, so that things that happen for a reason, and the chances are that they will happen again. The life cycle is a good example of that, and we tend to use that in Western science. And I find it a little bit funny how we talk about our life cycle of ourselves, of living things and of products in business terms, yet when we talk about time, the concept itself, we use it in a linear way, as you mentioned. Indigenous people do know that people are born, they go through stages in their lives, everyone goes through the same stage, and then they come to the time that we call death, and they prefer to use it or allude to the fact that their spirits then pass on to another level. And it's a very interesting and peculiar type of concept, I suppose, to us, because we're used to this linear time, but Indigenous people do look at that in a number of ways, in particular with their own lives, but also the lives of the natural environment around. They often were responsible for lighting fires in the bush, for example, because they knew that would regenerate growth in certain types of plants and also help the animal life that existed there as well. And it was a cycle again. They lived, or they understood, I suppose, that there were 4 seasons that we know now, but rather than have the 4 seasons come in one year and each year follow the other, as we believe now, they just understood that each season kept repeating, if you like, so that there were summers that happened, there were winters that happened. Of course, they would have had different names for them in those times, but it was just a cycle, and that there was no sort of looking back on what had happened in the past, because it was just a recurring type of lifestyle, if you like.
Yeah, because that's very interesting, because in Western culture there is that tendency to compare what the experience of today with yesterday. So, for example, when we talk about the drought, and was talking about it as being the worst in living history, and not having any kind of strategies to deal with that. Or the other thing I was thinking about when you were talking was this whole notion of backburning, which has also been on the agenda since we've had the bushfires. Yet it seems to me the way in which we would talk about this idea of backburning is quite different in relation to the perception of the environment than the Aboriginals' perception. In the Western context, it's very much about sustaining what I would call an artificial way of managing the land, whereas it seems to me that within Aboriginal culture that notion of sustainability is somewhat different.
Yeah, I suppose with the analogy of backburning, it's more like backburning we do today is done in a preventative way to stop bushfires getting to a certain area, or limiting their extent, if you like, whereas the Indigenous people, as I say, did it purely to regenerate growth in the natural environment. And I think another aspect of Indigenous life that's very different to Western science is the way that Indigenous people understood that the natural environment, or Mother Earth, as a lot of Aboriginal people call it, was in control of the Aboriginal people, rather than vice versa, as we tend to think. Western people today, we tend to think that the natural environment is there for our use and for our benefit, and we try and take advantage of it wherever we can, whereas the Indigenous people all over the world were more aligned to, or more attuned to the environment, in that they understood that if they treated the environment with respect, the environment would then treat them with respect. And it comes at the end from that notion of Mother Earth, and it's the term we use, Mother Earth, in Australia has different terms. Grandfather is one word I've heard in Northern America, but it's that connection with the land and the understanding that you need to respect the land, I think, that is more prominent in Indigenous society than it is in Western society today.
The other thing that one often hears about Aboriginal culture too is that it is not very technological, and yet I would have thought that there are many examples of highly efficient technology being used, such as the boomerang. And I think your mother makes wonderful eel traps too.
Yeah, the eel trap Mum designs, it's made out of grasses, or flax grass that she does, and she makes baskets out of it as well. It's just a really long tube with a sort of a flat end. It resembles the hat from the hat and what is it? The Cat in the Hat from Dr. Seuss books. It's a big, long sort of top hat type thing. And what the indigenous people used to do was just string a couple of grasses, long grasses to it, place it in the river and just leave it there. And what would happen is the eels would fly in, closed off at one end, of course, and the eels would, swim in, I should say, would swim into the trap. And eels being eels, they couldn't turn around and come back out, so they'd be trapped. And the indigenous people used to use them for food and other sorts of things, and bait in some cases as well. And it's a trial and error thing again, because they would have initially designed the eel traps a lot bigger and found that when they were watching, the eels would swim in and be able to get out. And gradually made them narrower and narrower until they discovered that eels could, at a certain diameter, the eels would go in and not come out again. Another example that I've heard is a guy called Dean Stewart, who runs Aboriginal Heritage Walks through the Royal Botanic Gardens in Melbourne. His walks just basically walk through the Botanic Gardens as they are, and he explains how the indigenous people would have used that landscape as it is today, because the landscape of the Botanic Gardens hasn't been altered much in the past couple of 100 years. So he talks about the trees and the rivers and the waterways and those sorts of things in the city. And one very interesting story that he told me was that there's a certain type of tree, and again I should find this out for you, and I will, that the indigenous people used to use the bark from to catch...
Acacia salica.
Thank you.
That's all right.
Used to catch fish, and how they discovered that was one day a tree fell into the river and they noticed all the fish were dead, lying around her, and they, gradually using different bits and pieces of that tree, worked out that it was something in the bark that was extracting oxygen from the water and suffocating the fish. So when we're talking about technology, we tend to think of technology as being, developments in the term technology alludes to us, computers.
Well, this is possibly the most powerful technology, isn't it, in Western culture, the writing implement.
Yeah. But yeah, that's what we think. Manufactured articles, if you like, that we use for our use and try and better our society, for want of a better term. Whereas technology in indigenous terms simply means using the environment to your advantage.
But the other thing that's really interesting about it too is the kind of difference in the notion of observation. Western science is very much premised on this idea of observation, recording details, checking for consistencies and things like that. And yet within Aboriginal culture, what you're sort of talking about is this close observation related to deep understanding as well. It's a kind of almost a non-interfering kind of way of doing it, letting nature carry itself, or letting nature carry you with it, rather than this kind of notion of control, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because all of those remarks you've made are premised on very close understanding of how the land operates.
And again, I think that comes back to when I was talking about circular time before. Young indigenous people get to a certain stage in their life, and it doesn't necessarily mean a certain age. It just means a certain stage, and that stage is determined in a lot of cases by the elders of the community. Now, when they reach a certain stage, they're permitted then to learn certain things. And a lot of these things will pertain to the environment. They're taught very early to respect the environment. And I suppose it's a lot of trial and error, which is something that in our education system today we don't have an awful lot of. But it's a lot of trial and error, so the children learn for themselves. If they mistreat the environment, the environment will then mistreat them. And I'm talking, the natural environment and animals as well. Things such as snakes, for example.
I've learned that lesson.
Yeah. So kids then learn through trial and error and how to respect the environment, and that's taught at a certain age. So as they get to each stage in their life, they're taught more and more about the environment. So very early on they're taught to respect the natural environment in that way. So it sort of becomes second nature to them, I suppose. And on the other side of that, or the Western side of that, and to show the contrast, is that in our school systems today, kids are taught, and students are taught by a variety of different people through their formative years, through primary school and high school, and they're a range of different people. And rather than have one, two or three, or just one core group, I suppose, if you like, of teachers, which would happen in Indigenous community in traditional life, they learn to respect those teachers, and they understand that these teachers have gone through these life stages, so they understand this from experience. Whereas in our education system and our way of life, our parents do teach us certain important and vital aspects of life, but more often than not we've got a wider variety of different people teaching us things, and I think that might lead to some of that respect that we don't seem to have for the natural environment, because we've got such an array of different people teaching. Not all of these people are in tune with the needs and the respect that we need to show for the natural environment. So I think that's a difference there as well. Lifestyle.
One of the things that really intrigued me too is that I've heard that Aboriginal people will refer to the landscape in terms of very close identity, and might say something like, that rock is my grandfather, or this tree is my grandmother, and that sort of intrigued me. But then I was sort of thinking too about at the big end picture of scientific research within Western culture, they're also coming to those kinds of ideas but from another route. For example, I was hearing one scientist talking about the fact that at the point of the Big Bang, there were so many atoms and neutrons existing in the universe, and there are no more than that. What happens is that we decay, and then those neutrons and atoms are reformed into new objects. And I thought, we're really talking the same thing here, to all intents and purposes. And it seems to me very interesting too that kind of big picture end of science, they're really talking about the importance of spirituality for explaining certain events in the universe. How else can they be explained, they say.
Yeah.
And I thought, isn't that interesting? It's moving from the minutiae to the big detail, and it seems a lot of Indigenous culture is about that very big scale way of thinking.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing again, but when I talk about Indigenous issues, I always like to mention that these are my own personal points of view. I'm learning more and more about spirituality myself, and I still struggle, because I was brought up in a Western education system, I still struggle to reconcile the two, if you like. I hear stories about how different things are created and how we treat the earth as our mother, and how the gum trees are our grandfather, and those sorts of things. And initially it's very hard to comprehend how you can believe these stories, if you like. But then if you have a look on the flip side, in the Western society, we either have 2 points of view, and there's often the argument of religion and science. And the religious people believe that the universe was created by the what's his name? God. And the scientists believe, of course, the Big Bang Theory, and there's really no way we can prove either of those. And I think it's a similar thing, and this is when I discuss these things with students who, one of them may be very strong about their certain point of view, whether they follow the Big Bang or they're very religious in their beliefs, and I just explain to them, well, how can someone who believes in the Indigenous way of life and spirituality and the spirit beings creating the universe as it is, how can we argue against that if we have no proof to really justify either one of them? A couple of interesting stories that have helped me sort of understand these things involve Badger Creek, and without knowing the details, I don't want to try and tell the story again, but my mother has a couple of stories, and I think we'll be able to get a video of a couple of them to explain them in more detail. But basically she used to tell me how her grandmother would tell her stories about Mount Riddle, which is a mountain up near Badger Creek in Hillsville, and how it was created because Bunjil the eagle, who is our creator spirit of the Wurundjeri Yarra Yarra people, was worried how he couldn't keep an eye on all his beings, all the creatures and people who lived in his earth, and he wanted to create a place where he could watch what happened and keep an eye on everyone. And so what he did was get the water spirit and the dust spirit and wind spirit to all work together, and wind spirit whipped up the dust, and rain spirit came down and formulated mud to create a mountain, and sun spirit dried all the mud and created Mount Riddle, so that Bunjil then could sit on top of Mount Riddle. If anyone's been to Hillsville Sanctuary, it's the big mountain just out the back, you can notice there as you're driving. And Mum used to tell me that story. When I was younger, when I first heard it, I sort of looked at it with a bit of scepticism, I suppose, but there is no reason now, if Indigenous people firmly believe in that spirituality, there's really nothing that Western science or any degree of, or in Western society, if you like, can disprove that to the Indigenous people. And as you say, when we talk about other things like stem cell research, and we look at the things that, and I'm thinking now, cancer in particular, we can't find a cure for cancer yet. It's the most natural disease, if you like, that we can find. And I think again, it just indicates that respect that we need to have for the natural environment. I'm just talking physical environment here. That the Indigenous people understood, and through their spirituality and stories from the dreaming and so forth, they understood and they tried to emphasise that everything that happens to them is created by the external environment in all its aspects. So they need to respect that in order to understand it, and if they can understand it, then hopefully they can work with it.
So it's a difference between trying to working with the environment, as you say, as against the environment, because a lot of those causes of cancer now are because of the presence of carcinogenic substances, which we in fact introduce, and through that introduction alter the environment in ways which is really quite unnatural, isn't it?
It is.